Kenneth is such an extraordinary human being. I've never met someone with so much passion and conviction when it comes to the banking industry.
I characterize him as a very humble individual. The notoriety he has and the visibility in his role, yet he can really relate to you one-on-one.
He's definitely a visionary, and he takes time away from his busy schedule. He'll always have time to have further discussions on topics that are important for the bank.
He's a very supportive leader, and he's present. Whenever we need him, he's available. And he's concerned about the community, he's concerned about the banking industry, and he's concerned about his team.
First Independence is historical. This year, it's 55 years old.
At the time he became chairman, we were around $250 million. And he said, we're going to become $1 billion bank. So he came in with that high goal, and we've been able to grow as a result of the same.
What Kenneth saw once he moved into the seat of CEO and chairman, he saw a lot of opportunity, an opportunity to really grow and expand the bank, not just in the Metro Detroit area, but possibly outside of the Detroit and multiple states.
He demonstrates amazing poise in moments of controversy and challenge and leadership, and that then gives comfort to those around him.
When I think of Kenneth and his leadership of the bank, he really is a beacon, because I don't know anyone who makes the business case for equity better than Kenneth Kelly. Everything from their financial performance to their staff, retention and attraction, he gives that message and walks the talk better than anyone I know.
All right, I'd like to welcome you to this edition of In the Conference Room with Mark S. Lee. Hope you're sitting back and enjoying a nice and wonderful day. Hey, by the way, of course, again, it's the holiday season. Happy holidays to everyone. And as you know, this is your source of information from the great city of Detroit. We have business leaders from across the great city of Detroit, the state of Michigan, as well as across the country. And today is no exception. I have a very special guest, as all my guests are very special, but this is a special occasion because we have Mr. Kenneth Kelly. He was recently elected the chairman of the American Bankers Association, which is a historical, certainly situation. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. He's also the chair of First Independence Bank of here, right in the great city of Detroit. So we are so pleased to have you in the conference room, Chairman Kenneth Kelly. Thanks for joining me.
Mark, thanks, and great to be with you as always. Thanks so much for letting your platform give us an opportunity to create connectivity to the community. I appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. My pleasure. And so you were just, and by the way, congratulations. We showed a video, certainly of you being introduced right before you came on the airwaves here. So talk about that historic situation, historic event, you being elected the chairman, the American Bankers Association, or being appointed. What is that? What's the significance of that?
Well, let me say the American Bankers Association represents over 2 million employees, basically all banks across this country, from the largest bank in Chase to the smallest de novo bank. So we have a very unique positioning in representing all banks and doing that extremely well. And so for me, as you can imagine, being an MDI, we have the opportunity to really kind of help set the agenda and tone for the association, having been on the board, and my peers who sit at the table, again, representing large, intermediate, and small banks, elected me to become chair of the organization. So it's an honor that I am grateful that have been chosen to serve in this role. It's historic in the manner that you just mentioned. And it just gives us an opportunity to have a voice at the table and make a difference. Because all of us know in a capitalistic society, money is the oxygen. And so we are so grateful to be able to represent First Independence Bank, the city of Detroit and Minneapolis as we sit in this seat and represent and be the voice of banking really all across the country. In fact, we will actually, on behalf of the ABA, represent banking on behalf of the U.S. in Tokyo this upcoming summer.
Mm. So for those who may be tuning in and not necessarily knowing what the ABA does, what is its primary role? What exactly is the role of the American Bankers Association?
Yeah, really, it is to be sure that we have a voice that is synchronized across all banking from a policy perspective, being sure we're represented, the policies that are active on behalf of banking, and that's across the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the regulatory aspect, being sure that our voices are heard there. But most importantly, also to look at creating support systems for the banking sector across the board. That could include things such as training and development, helping employees and helping banks be able to relate to the ABA or through the ABA to get resources that they wouldn't have otherwise based on their size. So there's a host of ancillary and auxiliary opportunities that the ABA presents on behalf of banking through this association. We're one of the most respected trade associations in Washington, D.C. But we really make an effort to be sure that the bank's interests are represented on the Hill. And again, looking out for those 2 million employees who work on behalf of banking and looking after roughly $25 trillion in assets in the banking space.
And what is your role as the leader now of the organization, as the chairman?
Well, it's to be sure, as any chair of the board, be sure your governance is in line and proper, being sure that we set the agenda to follow through. And we're doing that on three specific things. We're being a unifying advocate, which is kind of ties up everything I just shared to you. But in banking, also being sure we're an innovative catalyst right now. And then most importantly, being a trusted partner in everything that we do. So as chair of the board, we have to ensure that we've got committees that are operating. I believe I've appointed well over 500 individuals to certain committees to be sure that we are organized and operating with those of people from all across the 50 plus states and the provinces and regions of the United States. And we've got another set that's close to probably 400 of committees and volunteers who serve on different aspects of banking. So it's a really complex organization, Mark, but it's one that's certainly needed. And we run off not only a full-time staff that works across the country, but also a lot of volunteers. And it takes those volunteers willing to raise their hand and say, I'm willing to participate, give of my service in such a way that it is in order supporting the banking system.
And as you assume the leadership role, what is the single most important challenge or the biggest challenge that is out there today from a financial industry perspective, whether it's technology, regulation, or public trust? From your perspective, what is the biggest challenge that really needs to be addressed?
I wouldn't tell you it's the biggest challenge, but there are two things that certainly rise high on my list of things that I want to keep my eye on. And that's fraud, cybersecurity, fraud in general. You'll hear the ABA coming out and moving on this effort, being a leader, looking at a all hands on deck approach, not just the ABA and banking itself, but looking at some of those extensions into the government and other private businesses who can participate in mitigating fraud. So that's one that's certainly high on the list. But most importantly, I would tell you the human capital aspect of banking is one we've got to look at. I won't be sitting in this seat forever, and that's at ABA and First Independence Bank. So how are we developing leaders to come along and follow suit and learn from what we're doing in such a way that they are ready to sit in these seats across the banking space? So those are two areas that I would tell you that that is important to me as I lead through this upcoming year. But being sure that we are following along the lines that I just talked about, a unifying advocate on behalf of banking, innovative catalyst, talking about technology and how do we move there, and most importantly, being a trusted partner in the space is the three pillars of our strategic efforts.
And how long is the term?
My term, sir, is 1 year. So I served on the board now for 5 years in total, which is pretty long. But the reality is I'm moving through a rotation. So I was the vice chair for a year. I served as the chair-elect for a year, and I serve as now the chair for a full year, and then I'll be the immediate past chair a year. So we have an executive committee of 5 people typically. So I've been in that executive committee role now for 3 years. And so it's one that creates continuity, but also I will tell you a kinship and friendship with the individuals that you work with, because you're making very important decisions that are impacting not only people's lives, but the policies around this industry. And that committee just has really a very unique responsibility in helping to shape and lead the organization.
For those of you tuning in, I want you to understand this is truly a historical event. of historical proportions and significance with Kenneth Kelly being elected the chair of the American Bankers Association. This is truly, and it's an honor for me to have this conversation with him. Now, as you also see the background, he said his background, he's also, as I referenced, the chair and of First Independence Bank here in the city of Detroit. But I want to segue. You and I've talked before a lot about First Independence and certainly the financial services industry and certainly your role that you're currently playing. I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about your journey. I found
Certainly.
something. I've known you for a few years now. Um, I did not know you worked 30 years, if I can read this correctly or have done my notes correctly. You've worked several years in the industry, in energy space, in the energy space. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mark. And yes, we've known each other for several years now. And I would tell you, most people ask that question, how did you make the transition? And
Exactly right. That's
ironically,
the question.
of
Yeah.
all businesses, the utility space actually has more regulations on the book than the banking space. And so I tell people I have an understanding of how do you lead, motivate, maneuver in that environment and be able to do that also here. And from that perspective, it is very similar. And so my engagement, once I was selected and chosen to sit in this seat, allowed me to reflect on those experiences across those really 30 years. I served 27 total, but 30 affiliated in that space, all the way from being a co-op, being an engineer in the plants, rolling a distribution wheel, measuring the feet from one pole to the next, doing contracts with large businesses in industrial marketing, moved into corporate finance for a couple of years, and it ran actually the allocation on our trust, set up a TOLI for our nuclear decommissioning, and then moved over into human resources in the midst of what I call the Coca-Cola Jelly Bean Mitsubishi racial discrimination case. So we led unique efforts inside of our company in that regard, a separate entity reporting directly to the executives on that. And so from there, ended up in supply chain, worked in diversity as it relates to supplier diversity, worked also in sales leadership, and then did some M&A buying solar farms actually in California and Texas on behalf of the company. So I actually put the first flag of a solar farm in the state of California on behalf of Southern
Really?
Company, $500 million project. So that was in 2013. So we had some exceptional experiences there, building teams and doing some really big projects. And that really kind of parlayed into coming and sitting in this seat as chairman and CEO.
So I'm really curious. So how did you go from that space into financial services? I think people might be curious. How did you make that transition? Did someone approach you about going into financial services? How did that
Yeah,
happen?
so as you may know, this bank is family owned by Don Davis and Kiko Davis, and we unfortunately lost Don in 2014. I was asked to come and sit and begin thinking about helping to have some input into the decision making associated with that. And at the time, a gentleman you probably know, Barry Clay, was
Yeah.
serving as interim, and Barry has his own enterprise, very successful businessman. And he one day kind of looked at me sitting at the table, the board table, and said, "You need to be sitting in this seat." And so
Wow.
that, along with other many decisions, I'm using this metaphorically, but many decisions kind of led to us deciding to come and be voted on by the board. And the board makes a selection to support us sitting in this seat. So that's how a lot of that happened at a very high level.
And under your leadership, the assets have more than doubled. Certainly at First Independence Bank.
Yes, by far. We were about 200 plus million, and we're now right at 699 million at this point in time. And we've expanded into another city. That was part of our strategy to look at growing this institution. Banking is a very hand-to-hand combat business. It's very challenging in this marketplace, to be candid with
Yeah.
you, and banking is not an easy task every day. And we've been fortunate to really have some monumental success with First
Mhm.
Independence here in Detroit, and now also in the Minneapolis, St. Paul market.
And what was the defining strategy? What led you to land in that position of expansion, particularly beyond Detroit into other markets? What were the key principles that
Well,
drove your
Mark, if
decision?
being an engineer probably is one of those things that is a plus and a minus. For some people, for me, it's probably both. I made the effort to study banks across the system. And then I made a particular effort in studying minority depository institutions and specifically African American depository institutions. And at the time when I did this, the largest African American bank in the country at that point in time was a little bit over 600 million, which is less than where we are today, ironically. And that's just over the last 8 years. And what I found with those larger ones at that point in time, the largest, several of them had locations in multiple states. And so, ironically, it didn't matter if you were in New York, LA, Miami, Atlanta, each of those in their respective markets had this net, let's call it ceiling, for lack of not being able to grow beyond a certain point. And so I studied that and I looked at it and I looked at the data, and it didn't make sense to me, because I know you hear oftentimes about the amount of wealth in certain communities, but the numbers just didn't make sense. But what they were is specifically real. And so from that, I realized we're going to have to look at, a strategy beyond just trying to grow in one location that will allow us to expedite growing. And like most businesses, when they see that you're legitimately capable of growing out of market, people in your market say, oh, they've got it going on over there. And so maybe we ought to give them a try. And so we've seen, I would say, the duality of growth in both places in the midst of us kind of moving into the Minneapolis, St. Paul market. And in banking, it's slow. It is not a quick overnight fix. You have to go and be willing to be committed to it and grind and do it daily. And so now in about 3 years, we've been, I would call it, very successful there, to the point that we would do this all over again. And so that allowed us to really, it was based on data, to get to your question, but it certainly allowed us to have a perspective and reason why we wanted to try to grow. Because in the current market, trying to grow organically is extremely difficult. Your cost associated with compliance, with IT, cybersecurity, and human capital costs can outrun your ability to grow. And so we're seeing that. And I'll tell you one other thing is a fact in this marketplace. When I sat in this seat, there were 104 banking charters in the state of Michigan. There are now less than 80 in the state of Michigan. So you're seeing 25% decline in the number of banking charters in the state of Michigan. Now, let me be clear. That does not include your nationals like a Chase and Wells and others. Right. These are only state chartered banks like we are in First Independence. So 25% decline, and those numbers are going to continue to decline because of all of the economic factors that I talked about just a moment ago.
Is that decline also part of acquisitions, or just banks flat out going out of business?
It is. It's a part of acquisitions for the most part. There are very few, I would just say, people just saying, I'm going to close the doors and shut it down. Many of those are through some form of acquisitions or some form of takeover in most cases. So customers are still being served in most cases if they decide to stay with the institution. It just may be another name.
Yeah. And let's segue into the literacy gap in the financial space. And I know that you've made it under your leadership, First Independence Bank. It certainly has evolved in the community in Detroit as well as in Minnesota. Talk about that literacy gap. Why is it there? Why aren't young people really just a little bit more literate when it comes to that space as we think about the future?
Well, I would like to change the term a little bit and use the term financial wellness. And we believe in that. It's the premise of why this institution was started. We were one of the positive outcomes of the 67 riots. And when you think about it, banks are beacons of hope. You can't go to any city and not look for one of the tallest buildings and not see a bank sign or bank name on those buildings. So the banks are beacons of hope. And we try to embody that daily in terms of what we do. So let's deal with the numbers that talks about wellness, that talks about financial prowess. When you look at home ownership, which as any individual, the first cornerstone for building wealth is typically equity in a home. And you know that the minority community, specifically the African American community, has the lowest home ownership in the country. So that doesn't get to the amount of the value of the home. This is just specifically home ownership as a percent of population. That number is about 42 to 44% in the African American community. In the Caucasian community, that number is about 75%. Now, again, if I own a house that's worth $50,000 and someone else in another community owns one worth $250,000, this is not accounted for in that gap. This is just strictly the entry of having a home as kind of the base point for saying you are now generating and hopefully creating some form of wealth that you can leave to someone else. So home ownership is a cornerstone of that, and we believe that it's something that we need to talk about. The challenges, is you ask about them, really our community in terms of how do we deal with this? We got to be sure that it's not or no longer taboo to talk about money. It's not or it shouldn't be taboo to talk about our own demise. As you know, I've written a book on that topic. And so we kind of project what we do, and we've got to change that, Mark. And so I'm glad that you're having a show like this, that someone who may listen to this conversation understands the importance of talking about budgeting, talking about savings, talking about building for retirement. I would tell anyone, getting back to another financial wellness point, that, you know, if you start at the age of your early 20s when you finish college or finish trade school or finish whatever it is you decide to work on, you save anywhere from 15 to 18% of that and invest it properly. That doesn't mean you have to go and do crazy things, just basic investments where, you know, you may use some form of an ETF or mutual funds. You can actually build enough wealth that by the time you get to your early 60s, you should be able to live off of 80% of your income. Now, that's just basic math. That's a financial wellness, basic math that we need to talk more about so that people subscribe to it. And I would tell you, I'm as human as anyone else, and I've made financial mistakes. I'll tell you about one that gets to a point that I think is very important. You know, we had lost our mother at a very young age to breast cancer. And for whatever reason, there was a type of car that she had thought about buying and wanting. And I found myself in that year of grief buying that particular type of car. I didn't need it, but I bought it. And needless to say, I had enough remorse about it that I ended up selling it. And what I did was immediately move the money associated with that into retirement. I can tell you, without a doubt, that was a very expensive car if you look at the value associated with what happened with those dollars versus what would have happened had I kept, you know, at that point in time paying for that car. And I'm in my mid 20s at that point in time. And so my point is that, you know, we're all human. There are things we have to experience and learn. But the reality is, think about what are your end goals, begin with the end in mind, and then chart a path to figure out what it is you would like to do, would be my suggestion to anyone listening to us on Our Voice.
I think that is a great recommendation, suggestion, because that's really my next and final question is that if you had to give a piece of advice to someone in their 20s, you know, someone coming out of college right now. Here it is, December. Graduations are now occurring. Congratulations, by the way, to all the graduates from the fall semester. What advice would you give to those young people graduating and to those in their 20s? You kind of alluded to it a moment ago, but if there's one or two pieces of advice, what would you give to them?
Yeah, I would tell you, write your goals down. I'm a firm believer of that. I went back to my high school. They call them memory books where people sign and you take pictures. And I wrote, where would I be in 5 years? Where would I be in 10 years? And subconsciously, those things came true. There is not a perfect path to those destinations. So be willing to understand that it won't be a clear path for every decision journey that you will get to. For instance, when I bought my first house, it was at the age of 25. I will tell you that I had what I thought might have been enough money to make the down payment on it. But I didn't quite have all of the down payment, but it worked out. And the point I'm making is, had I waited for it to be perfect, then I probably wouldn't have been as fortunate to buy that very first house at the age of 25. And so I would tell you that's some of the risk I think we have to embrace taking along the way, that things aren't going to always be perfect, even though you write the goals down of how you want them to work out. They become part of the journey. And so my advice back to your question is trust the process. Had I gone back and looked at my career, would I have said, you know what, I want to be in this seat and that's where I want to be? No, I wouldn't have. But I can tell you that the fundamentals of growing every day, challenging myself, understanding that I need to get better each and every day in terms of what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to accomplish, led to the subsequent opportunities that prepare you for those destinations. And so, had I not done the solar projects, I probably wouldn't have had the breadth of experience to really sit in this seat and appreciate it from that perspective. Could I have moved into it? Probably. But I will tell you, those assignments, working on building teams cross-functional across a company, making a $500 million investment, getting it approved by the board of directors, and having to stand behind how you mitigated all of the risk is something that I would tell you can be life-changing. And my point is, each of those things are building blocks from all of those experiences from day one. And while you can probably say you want to be in a certain destination, oftentimes you got to be sure that you're enjoying the journey along the way that can prepare you for that destination.
Embrace the journey, embrace the opportunity, and look at it just as that. Look at it as an opportunity. A lot of times we look at it as an issue or a challenge. No, embrace the journey and embrace the opportunity. Chairman Kenneth Kelly, this was truly an engaging conversation. I've enjoyed it. Again, to all those tuning in, he is now the chairman of the American Bankers Association, which is of historical significance. He's also the chairman and CEO of First Independence Bank here in the great city of Detroit, as well as they've expanded into Minnesota. Make sure that we get the proper due as well. Kenneth Kelly, thank you very much. You're awesome. I always enjoy these conversations with you. I appreciate your input. Thank you so much. And by the way, one more time, the website for First Independence is
www.firstindependence.com. FIRSTINDEPENDENCE.com.
You got it. Thank you again. I appreciate it. All right,
Thanks,
for those
Mark.
of you
Great
tuning
to be with you.
absolutely. For those of you again tuning in, but you go out, make it a great day, make it a great week. Thanks for tuning into this edition of In the Conference Room with Mark S. Lee. We will check you out next time. Take care, everyone.